Danny Thompson had always despised gym class, but more than anything, he loathed Mr. Kirby, the man's booming voice, his eyes that seemed to see everything, and that sickening whistle. Danny hated it all. But what he hated most was the way Mr. Kirby's presence made the air feel heavier, like something was always watching, always waiting. All Danny wanted was to get home, to escape the suffocating heat of the gym and the even more suffocating atmosphere of the school. He longed to return to the solitude of his room, where he could watch the live stream of the corpse he'd left in the woods. He couldn't wait to see it again, the twisted beauty of it, the way the pale skin looked under the moonlight, the blood staining the earth beneath it. But instead, he was here, dragging himself around the track, his sneakers pounding against the asphalt, the heat like a living thing, crawling up his legs and wrapping around his chest. The air burned in his lungs, every breath like fire, but Danny didn't care. He smiled as his glasses slipped down his nose, sweat blurring his vision. In his mind, he saw the beautiful blind girl, her body lying lifeless in the redwood forest, her limbs twisted in unnatural ways. The curve of her hips, the hollow of her throat, the blood that had poured from her severed arm, it was all so perfect. Hustle, hustle. Hold your head up. Mr. Kirby's voice cut through Danny's thoughts like a blade, and he shuddered. The man was always there, looming like a shadow, his presence a constant reminder that Danny was never truly alone. Danny fought to keep his pace, his legs burning, his shorts chafing against his skin. His glasses slid again, and he pushed them up, his fingers trembling slightly. Mr. Kirby stood at the edge of the track, clapping his massive hands together with a sickeningly loud sound. He lifted the whistle to his thick lips and blew 3 sharp, piercing notes that made Danny's skin crawl. It was as if the sound itself was a signal, a call to something lurking just out of sight. Danny's stomach churned, but he kept running, his eyes fixed on the empty space ahead of him. The other boys were finished, gathered in a huddle, chatting and laughing, unaware of the darkness that consumed Danny's thoughts. He could still see her, the girl, her body broken and perfect in its stillness. He could almost hear her whispering to him, calling him back to the woods. Mr. Kirby was watching him now, his eyes narrowing, a strange smile twisting his lips. Danny felt a cold shiver run down his spine. The man was too big, too powerful, his presence too overwhelming. It was like he knew what Danny had done. It was like he could see the blood on Danny's hands, even if no one else could. As Danny rounded the final bend, he could feel Mr. Kirby's eyes on him, like the man was waiting for something. Waiting for him to break, waiting for him to collapse. But Danny didn't stop. He never stopped, not when the heat threatened to consume him. Not when the world around him seemed to grow darker, colder. Because in the end, Danny knew that Mr. Kirby was just another part of the game, another obstacle to overcome. And once he crossed that finish line, he could go back to his room, back to the forest, back to her. He touched his bald, gleaming head, which sat atop his shoulders like an unsteady boulder poised to roll down a mountain. There was something unsettling about it, the way his massive, misshapen head seemed too large for his body, like it might topple at any moment. Mr. Kirby had a strange habit of snarling, his upper lip curling into an animal-like sneer even when he was smiling. It was as if his mouth could never fully relax, always pulled into a twisted expression of menace, even when he spoke. His words came out in a growl, deep and threatening, each syllable dripping with a barely contained rage. "Move it, Thompson." He barked, his voice like the snap of a guard dog's teeth. He always called Danny by his last name, as if they were in the military, as if he were a drill sergeant and Danny, a recruit meant to be broken. The command was as cold as it was forceful, and Danny could feel the weight of it pressing down on him. His eyes narrowed, but he didn't respond. To Danny, Mr. Kirby was just another in a long line of bullies who had tormented him his whole life. He'd always been smaller than the other boys, weaker, more fragile. The thick glasses perched on his nose only made it worse. 4 eyes, bug eyes, bubble boy. The cruel nickname started in 3rd grade and never stopped. But it wasn't just his size that made him a target. It was his mind, his intelligence, his sharp, piercing IQ of 165 that had him skipping the 7th grade and jumping straight into 8th. And now, as a sophomore, he was not only smaller than the others, but slower, less coordinated. Mr. Kirby never let him forget it. Come on, move it, Thompson. At least finish, for God's sake. The words were sharp, like a whip cracking in the air, making Danny flinch. He pushed himself harder, his legs aching, his lungs burning as he stumbled over the finish line. The other boys didn't even try to hide the way they looked at him, eyes filled with disgust, pity, and a mocking cruelty. He was the weak one, the one to be laughed at, the one to be sneered at. They saw him as something less than human, a pathetic thing to be ridiculed. Danny forced himself to ignore it, to pretend he didn't see their eyes, didn't hear their cruel whispers. "All right, hit the showers, everybody," Mr. Kirby announced, his voice dripping with that same sickening sneer, the canines on the left side of his mouth exposed as he spoke. His hands clapped together loudly, the sound echoing in the empty space, before he placed them firmly on his hips, elbows jutting out in a way that made him seem even more imposing. The boys whooped and hollered, laughing and pushing each other as they made their way to the locker room. Danny followed, his feet dragging, his head lowered in shame. He could feel their eyes on him, could feel the weight of their laughter pressing down on him like a suffocating fog. He walked slowly, deliberately, his steps heavy as he shuffled down the hall to his locker. There was no escape from it, not from them, not from Mr. Kirby. Danny slumped onto the cold concrete bench, his body stiff with discomfort. Without a second thought, he swiftly shed his gym clothes, slipping into his black jeans and white button-up shirt. He ignored the other boys as they swaggered toward the showers, their laughter and wisecracks echoing off the tile walls. The sound grated against him, a reminder of how alien he felt here. Danny never took a shower after gym class. The thought of standing there, exposed, vulnerable before the others, filled him with a deep, gnawing dread. His skin crawled just thinking about it, their eyes on him, judging, mocking. The idea of being naked in front of them was too much, too raw. He'd only been in California for a little over a year. His mother had dragged him here after the fight with his father. It had been loud, ugly, a storm of words that had shaken the house to its core. The neighbors had called the cops, and Danny had watched helpless as the flashing red and blue lights spun through the windows, the sound of sirens ringing in his ears. His father had been led away in handcuffs, his face twisted in rage, while his mother had packed up their lives into the old Buick station wagon. She had taken Danny and his 6-year-old sister, fleeing to California for a fresh start, desperate to escape the chaos of Oregon before his father could make bail and try to talk her back into the nightmare. But the fresh start hadn't been what Danny had hoped for. His mother had changed, transformed into something unrecognizable. Gone were the jeans and sweatshirts she used to wear, blending in with the other redneck moms back in Oregon. Now she wore long flowing dresses with garish floral prints, anklets of bells that jingled with every step, and an amethyst necklace that seemed to shimmer with an unnatural glow. Crystals and scented candles littered their home, filling the air with strange, overpowering fragrances. She'd even taken up a job at the co-op health food store, spending Sundays attending classes on herbalism and alternative medicine. But that wasn't the worst of it. No, the worst part was Gail, a woman who seemed to be a perfect match for his mother's new bizarre lifestyle. She wore the same floral prints, spoke in the same airy, dreamlike tone, and seemed to exist in a world entirely separate from reality. Danny couldn't stand her. He hated the way she looked at him, as if she saw right through him, as if she knew all his darkest secrets. And then there was the new school. It wasn't just the unfamiliar faces or the constant whispering behind his back that unsettled him. It was the way he felt like a stranger in his own skin. The way the halls seemed to close in around him. The way every glance felt like an accusation, every laugh like a knife to his chest. The kids here were different, colder. They didn't care about the things he cared about. They didn't understand him. And that made him feel more alone than he had ever been before. As he pulled his shirt over his head, Danny couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something was always wrong. He could feel it lurking just beneath the surface, like a shadow that never quite left him. Something was waiting for him here, something that would make the past year seem like nothing more than a prelude to the real horror. Danny had to hide. The kids at school were hipsters now, a far cry from the rednecks his father used to hang with. His father had once listened to strange music, things Danny was unfamiliar with, dubstep, crust punk. It all felt like a foreign language to him, and he felt just as alienated from them as he had from the Hicks back in Bedford, those ignorant, backward fools. He despised them all. At his new school, Danny's presence was invisible. He slipped through the halls unnoticed, his classmates oblivious to his existence. He passed all his classes effortlessly, barely lifting a finger. Anything that piqued his interest was easy to master, and he breezed through it within a but he wasn't interested in most things. He was moody, distant, often disdainful of his teachers. He would argue obscure points with them, always sure he was right, and more often than not, he'd irritate them to the point where they just gave up, passing him with a begrudging C, hoping he would go away and leave them in peace. But gym class, that was different. It was the one place where he didn't excel, the one place where he was constantly called out in front of his peers. Mr. Kirby would bark at him, his voice like a whip, demanding that he put some hustle into it or follow through with the swing. His fat, bulging eyes would search the room for any sign of weakness, any student to humiliate. Danny felt exposed, like a rat under a spotlight, scurrying around trying to find a dark corner to hide in. It was as if the rock that had once shielded him from the world had been lifted, and now he was a hideous creature, exposed to the harsh light of day, desperate to retreat into the shadows where he felt safe. The first time Danny had read The Metamorphosis, he had understood exactly what Gregor Samsa had felt. Waking up one morning, transformed into a monstrous vermin, Danny knew that sensation all too well. He knew the horror of waking up and realizing that the world saw you as something grotesque, something to be shunned, something that didn't belong. It was a silent, invisible suffering. Danny was in the library one afternoon, buried in a book Philip Carlo's The Night Stalker for the fourth time. He was used to the quiet, the isolation, the feeling of being hidden in plain sight. The school play that year was going to be A Streetcar Named Desire, but Danny couldn't care less. A group of girls nearby whispered about the girl playing Stella, giggling and gossiping, but their words were just background noise to him. They didn't matter. Nothing mattered. He was the thing that lurked in the corners, the one who would never be seen for who he truly was, because no one ever looked close enough. No one ever saw the dark things crawling beneath the surface. Can you believe Credence got the lead? The voice was shrill, loud, chewing gum with a sickening snap. She twisted a lock of her hair around her finger, eyes glinting with a twisted, venomous satisfaction. She was so ugly all her life. I mean, just a year ago, she was the ugliest girl in school, like a dog, an underdog, a clown dog. The other girl, who sat beside her, giggled in agreement. And now she gets the lead role. It's so unfair. Danny could feel the bile rise in his throat as he listened to their conversation, their shallow judgments cutting through the air like knives. He muttered to himself, "They probably haven't even read A Streetcar Named Desire." He pushed his glasses up his nose, the motion too sharp, too deliberate. He slammed his book shut with unnecessary force, the sound echoing in the otherwise quiet library, and stood up. He walked away, his footsteps heavy as he made his way to the corner of the room, the shadows there seeming to call to him. The library was his sanctuary. The scent of old books, the comforting silence. It was the only place where he could disappear into the pages and forget about the world. The other students were oblivious, scattered in their own little worlds. Danny didn't care. He never cared about them. He settled into his favorite corner, surrounded by the towering spines of books, each one like an old friend, a companion in his isolation. His eyes drifted over to the other students, noting the long-haired kid in the faded black t-shirt, buried in a Stephen King novel. What a fool, Danny thought, sneering. It was nothing. A stupid fictional alien clown. But what Danny was reading, that was real. The Night Stalker, Richard Ramirez. A real monster. Danny's fingers brushed over the pages, the words sending a chill through him. Here was a man who thrived in the darkness, lurking in the night like a shadow, watching through windows while his victims slept, unaware. He would slip silently into their homes, his presence undetected until it was too late. His victims, the lucky ones, were executed quickly, a gunshot to the head. But the unlucky ones? They were tortured, raped. Their eyes ripped from their sockets, leaving them blind to the horror that was about to unfold. Danny's eyes glazed over as he read, his mind consumed by the terror. There was something comforting in the brutality of it, something soothing in the darkness. It was real, it was raw, and it was a world he could understand. Unlike the fake, shallow world outside, where people like Credence got everything they didn't deserve, and Danny was left alone in the shadows watching. Always watching. Their spilled blood had been used to scrawl satanic messages, twisted pentagrams smeared across the walls in a grotesque display. This was no fantasy, no rationalizing, no denying. It was real, it was fact, and Danny was obsessed. He wasn't just fascinated, he was consumed by it. Serial killers were his world, their darkness his obsession. He could rattle off the exact number of bodies found in John Wayne Gacy's crawl space, the names of the girls he'd stashed away in secret places for his perverse, nocturnal acts. He knew where the ones who had been left to die were found, their bodies discarded like garbage. He could describe the bones Gacy had used to fashion into bizarre trophies, the instruments of torture the hillside stranglers had used to break their victims, the dates of birth and execution for Albert Fish. Danny devoured true crime books, the more heinous the better. His room was a shrine to violence, littered with stacks of them, their covers worn and creased from constant use. The stranger beside me, in cold blood, Zodiac books he had read so many times. He could recite entire passages from them, as if they were his own thoughts. They were his Bible, his escape, his comfort. It was his grandmother who had sparked this dark obsession, her death fueling the compulsion that had taken root in him. When she passed, it was as if a part of him died with her. She had been more than just a grandmother. She was his second mother. She was the one who had taken him to the mall, bought him clothes, gave him books and pencils for school. She was the one who had been there when his parents fought, the one who took him in when his mother needed a break from the chaos of her own life. But now she was gone, and her death had left a hole in him, one that he filled with the darkness of his new obsession. He inherited all of her books, the ones she had cherished, and they became his lifeline. They were all he had left of her, but they also became his prison, trapping him in a world of death and decay. The more he read, the more he understood the monsters he studied, the more he felt connected to them. And as the pages turned, Danny found himself drifting further from the world of the living, deeper into the shadows where the real monsters lurked. She was the one who had fostered his love of the macabre, the one who had unknowingly set him on the path of darkness. It was her copy of In Cold Blood, sitting in the dust on her shelf, that had ignited his obsession with true crime. When Danny had brought the hardcover book to his grandmother, its black paper cover worn and faded, she had been slouched over in her chair, lost in one of her Agatha Christie mysteries. But when she saw the book, her wizened face grew serious, her eyes narrowing with something akin to reverence. "Ah, Truman Capote," she had whispered, her voice low and almost reverent. "This, Danny, is an important piece, the first true crime book, but also a work of literature." He had nodded thoughtfully, pushing his glasses up his nose, already feeling the weight of the words. He sat down beside her, the air thick with the scent of old paper and lavender, and began to read about the cold-blooded killers who haunted the pages. He hadn't stopped since. The darkness had taken root in him, and it was all he could think about now. When his grandmother passed, Danny's sister had been told she was too young to attend the wake, but Danny was different. He was mature, older than his years, and his mother, with a quiet sadness in her eyes, dressed him in a navy blue suit that was far too big for him. The fabric hung off his thin frame, the weight of it making him feel like a doll, a puppet strung up in the adult world. They took him to the funeral home, a dimly lit room that smelled like old wood, flowers, and the sterile tang of Lysol. It was surreal, the kind of place where the boundaries between the living and the dead blurred, where people sat around eating potato salad off of paper plates with plastic forks, laughing as if they were at a picnic, as if death were just another inconvenience. The older, gray-haired strangers, people Danny didn't recognize, kept coming up to him, hugging him, shaking his hand. They told him how much he had grown, how mature he was. But Danny didn't feel grown up. He felt out of place, the suit hanging off him like a shroud, making him feel like a corpse before his time. His uncles, his mother's two older brothers, were there too, passing a flask back and forth, their voices too loud, talking about old girlfriends and long-forgotten memories. When they tried to offer the flask to Danny, his mother scolded them sharply, her voice cold and tight. "Don't you dare," she hissed, pulling him away from them, her fingers digging into his arm as they moved to the front of the hall. In that room, surrounded by the scent of decay and the false cheer of those who couldn't seem to understand the gravity of the situation, Danny felt the pull of something darker. The laughter, the chatter, it all felt wrong. He wasn't like them. He wasn't like anyone here. He was already lost in a world that no one else could see. A world of blood, of death, of true crime. And he knew, deep down, that he would never escape it. What appeared to Danny as some kind of tiny stage or altar was his grandmother, lying serenely in a half-closed coffin. Her face, unnaturally smooth, was exposed, but her lower half was shrouded in cold steel. The sight was almost ritualistic, the way she lay there, unnatural, untouched by life. People wandered up to the casket in a strange, hushed reverence, whispering as if they believed she could still hear them, still feel their presence. They would touch her, fondle her lifeless hand, press their lips to her cold cheek, caress her face, and tuck stray locks of her now blue-gray hair behind her ear. Danny stood frozen, unable to comprehend the macabre reverence they bestowed upon her. His mother pushed him forward, her face twisted in grief as she dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, her voice strained. "Go on," she urged. "Say goodbye. Say goodbye to Grandma." The words felt hollow, foreign, as if she was asking him to say goodbye to a stranger. He stumbled forward, apprehensive, a creeping fear crawling up his spine. He stepped up to the casket, his heart pounding, and stared at his grandmother. Her face had been overdone with makeup, too much, too thick. It was smeared and smudged, remnants of where mourners had kissed her or run their fingers over her face. The lifeless body before him, the woman who had meant so much to him, felt distant, alien. It wasn't her anymore. Not really. It was just a hollow shell, a mockery of the person he had loved. He wanted to touch her like the others did, but his hand froze. He was scared to touch this thing that once held so much warmth, but now was cold and unyielding. He had wanted to cry, to feel the sorrow that was expected of him, but he couldn't. He felt nothing. He could do nothing but turn away, push his glasses up his nose, and shuffle back to his seat with his head bent low. That lonely summer stretched on, endless and suffocating. With no friends, no school to distract him, he roamed the house, buried in the trove of true crime books he had salvaged from his grandmother's estate. Each page he turned pulled him deeper into the darkness, the twisted world of killers and their victims. It was during that hot, melancholic summer that he discovered the Manson family, their eerie, chaotic existence, and something else, something darker. It was then that he discovered masturbation, his own twisted form of release. But it wasn't just the physical act that consumed him. It was the depravity that filled his mind, the images of violence and death that swirled together with his own fantasies. That summer, his world became darker, more detached, as he fell deeper into a void of obsession and solitude, unable to escape the macabre pull of his own thoughts. He had found that black book with the dripping blood-red letters and a battered cardboard cover, discarded by his mother, who hadn't gotten around to taking it to the thrift store. That night, in the dim glow of his flashlight, Danny lay under the covers, the musty, dog-eared copy of Helter Skelter in his hands. It had once belonged to his grandmother, and now it was his, a treasure of twisted knowledge. The covers were pulled tightly over his head, the world outside reduced to a blur as he flipped through the pages. The words swam before his eyes, acid-fueled orgies, the violent chaos of the Manson family, the lost girls, their bodies desecrated and broken. His right hand moved without thought, his left holding the book steady, as his eyes devoured the images of those hippie girls, their innocence lost in the madness. His breath quickened, the words and the images mixing with his own twisted desires. He couldn't look away. He shuddered as his body responded, a dark, filthy satisfaction flooding him. It wasn't just the violence or the sex, it was the raw, uncontrollable chaos that he found so intoxicating. The moonlight poured in through the window, casting silver shadows over his small, dim room. He looked down at the small black and white photo of Ruth Ann Morrison, her face frozen in death, an axe carved into her forehead. The image burned into his mind, and he moaned quietly, unable to resist the pull of his own twisted thoughts. It was his first time, the first time he climaxed to the image of death, of violence, of something broken and irrevocably lost. The day he found the dead girl in the copse of trees began like any other bad. The night before, he'd gotten into a wicked fight with his mother, and in the morning, she told him there would be severe repercussions. Danny didn't know what that meant, but he suspected, with grim certainty, that it had something to do with his internet time. That was the only thing he cared about anymore, and he feared she might take it from him. The incident, as his mother had called it, had happened the night before, during dinner. His mother's partner Gail was there, a massive woman who wore what could only be described as a muumuu. She made tofu, steaming kale, and talked non-stop about positive energy vibrations. Danny hated tofu. He hated everything about it. But most of all, he hated how everything felt suffocating, like a slow, creeping claustrophobia that made him feel like he was drowning in their fake positivity. That day, when he wandered out into the woods, he found something far worse than his mother's reprimands. It was in the copse of trees near the edge of town, where the wild, tangled brush hid secrets. The girl dead, pale and twisted, lay there, discarded like a broken doll, her face frozen in a scream that would never escape her lips. Her eyes were wide, staring into nothingness, her body marked by the violence that had claimed her. Danny knelt beside her, his heart pounding in his chest. It was like he had found something he had always been searching for. Something dark. Something that pulled at him in ways he couldn't explain. He didn't know why, but he touched her, his fingers brushing against her cold skin, tracing the lines of death on her body. He wasn't scared. He felt exhilarated. Alive in a way that was wrong, that felt so far from what he should have been. The world around him seemed to fade, and for the first time in a long time, Danny felt like he had found something that truly understood him. The kale was grown on a biodynamic farm, which meant the seeds were planted under the new moon, harvested on the full moon, syncing up with the natural rhythms and vibrations of Gaia, their Earth Mother. That's what Gail said, her voice thick with that smug, airy conviction as she laid steaming dishes of food before them. His mother nodded along, whispering blessed be when Gail set her plate down in front of her. Danny felt his stomach churn as he watched his mother, so deeply enmeshed in this absurdity, so far gone into the New Age nonsense. But what truly disgusted him was his sister, Melissa. She sat there, happily devouring the steaming kale, blissfully unaware of how far they had drifted from anything familiar. She was so lost in this perfect little New Age family fantasy. It was as though she didn't even see how alien everything had become. She didn't realize how they'd never see their father again, or how their mother had turned into some kind of hippie lesbian, lost to the world. Melissa just sat there, her face flushed with joy, bouncing her head back and forth as she jabbered on about birthday parties. Her pigtails jiggled with each word, like some sickeningly innocent parody of childhood. "Allison's having an ice cream cake and a sleepover," she chirped, oblivious to the world around her. "Jenny's mom says a sleepover is too much, but she's having a clown and a magician, of course. I was invited to both parties, but Karen wasn't. Jenny hates Karen." Danny stared at her, his mind numb with disgust. He pushed a hunk of tofu through the muddy puddle of Thai peanut sauce, dragging it up to the lumpy green mass of kale. His elbow rested heavily on the table, his chin perched on his fist, as he listened to his sister prattle on like a little fool, completely unaware of how far gone everything was. When she finally stopped, Danny couldn't hold it in anymore. His eyes narrowed behind his glasses, and he pushed them up his nose with a deliberate motion, his voice cold. "Well, that's very interesting," he muttered. "What's with all the ice cream and cake and parties?" His words dripped with disdain, his gaze fixed on her as if she were some kind of alien, so removed from reality. He couldn't stand her, couldn't stand this entire charade. It was all so wrong, so out of place. And yet, it was the only world left to him. Danny leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on his sister, a cold smirk curling at the corners of his mouth. He let the silence hang in the air for a moment. Then with a chilling calmness, he spoke. "I was wondering, how do you and your friends deal with the fact that we're all going to die? Do you have your little parties, your distractions, to keep the thought of the grave at bay? Or has it never even crossed your little pea-sized brain that one day you too will be dead?" His mother's face went pale, her eyes wide with shock. She slammed her hand on the table. "Danny!" she shouted, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and fear. But Danny didn't flinch. He just turned to his sister, his gaze cold and piercing. His glasses gleamed in the dim light as he pushed them up his nose, his voice dropping to a low, sinister murmur. "And then you, Melissa. You'll be next." Melissa's eyes widened in terror, her lower lip quivering as she stared at him, unable to process his words. A single tear rolled down her cheek as her voice broke. "Mommy, you're not going to die, are you?" She whimpered, her voice small and fragile, like a child who had just realized the world wasn't as safe as she thought. Danny's eyes never left her. He calmly plopped a piece of tofu into his mouth, chewing it slowly, savoring the sound of her distress. "Well, death is just another change," he murmured with unsettling detachment. "When the time comes, I'll welcome it. It's all part of my soul journey." Melissa's eyes were now wide with fear, her face streaked with tears as she began to sob uncontrollably. "I don't want to die. I don't want Mommy to die," she cried out, her voice rising to a desperate wail. Danny's mother jumped up from the table, her hands trembling as she rushed to her daughter. She wrapped her arms around Melissa, pulling her close and pressing her face into her stomach, rocking her back and forth in a frantic, almost panicked motion. She stroked Melissa's hair, but her eyes, darting nervously, betrayed the terror she felt deep inside. The room was heavy with the weight of their unspoken fear, the air thick with the suffocating realization that No matter how hard they tried to ignore it, death was always lurking just around the corner. It's okay, Mommy's fine. Nothing's going to happen to Mommy, she murmured, her voice trembling, but her eyes darted toward Danny with a venomous glare. Look at what you've done. The words hung in the air, thick with a bitter resentment. Danny's lips curled into a twisted sneer. Like I care, he spat, his voice cold and venomous. In an instant, he leapt to his feet, knocking his chair over with a crash. You stupid dyke, he hissed, his words like acid. You disgust me. You make me sick. His mother recoiled, but Danny didn't care. His eyes were wild, his body trembling with rage. Apologize. Right now. She screamed, her voice cracking with fear and frustration. But Danny didn't hear her. He was already racing up the stairs, his feet pounding against the wooden steps, slamming the door behind him with a force that made the house shudder. He threw himself onto his bed, burying his face into the pillow, his body shaking with violent sobs he never let escape when his grandmother died. The grief, the loss, the suffocating emptiness. He missed Oregon, the old street lined with fir trees, the days when he was a little boy, before everything had become so wrong. He missed his father, the big burly man with the thick beard and the mop of orange hair. Back then, Danny had been terrified of him. He remembered the sound of the door slamming open at night, his father stumbling in, drunk, shouting, breaking things. And then the unmistakable sound of his mother's sobs, followed by that sharp, sickening slap. It had all felt like a nightmare. The bell rang, snapping Danny out of his dark reverie. The students around him stood up, chattering and heading for the door, but Danny remained still, his head hanging low. Mr. Jones, the stuffy English teacher with his potbelly and perpetually disheveled sweater jacket, called him over with a stern voice. Danny, I need to talk to you for a moment, he said, his bushy salt and pepper mustache twitching as he absently stroked it. Danny pushed his glasses up his nose, his movements slow and deliberate, as if the weight of the world was pressing down on him. He dragged his feet across the linoleum, each step like a heavy, reluctant march toward whatever fate awaited him. Mr. Jones was always a strange one. The kind of teacher who thought his presence was important, who stroked his mustache as if it held the answers to life's deepest questions. Today, though, he was staring down at a bundle of papers on his desk, lost in thought as if the conversation he was about to have with Danny was just another mundane task. But Danny didn't care. He never did. All he could think about was the chaos that swirled in his mind, the suffocating darkness that never seemed to let him go. Mr. Jones leaned forward, his eyes narrowing, a hint of confusion flickering in his gaze as he stared at the paper in his hands. His fingers trembled ever so slightly as he lifted the sheaf of papers, the edges rustling like the soft whisper of something ancient and forgotten. He pointed accusingly at Danny, his voice low and steady, but with an undercurrent of something darker. What is this? He asked, his voice barely a whisper, like he was afraid the answer might somehow escape into the room and poison the air. Danny mumbled back, his words almost inaudible, his gaze cast downward as if he were hiding from the question. My English report. Mr. Jones' eyes flicked to the paper again, his brow furrowing deeper as he read the title. This is supposed to be on Call of the Wild, Danny. You were supposed to write about Jack London. And instead, his voice trailed off, the words hanging in the air like a thick, suffocating fog. This. Danny shrugged, his movements sluggish, as if the weight of the conversation was too much to bear. London's a hack. Everybody knows that. Mr. Jones inhaled sharply, the room growing colder, the tension thickening with each passing second. You could have said that in your report, Danny. If you had backed it up with solid arguments, it would have been fine. But instead, you did exactly what I told you not to do. His voice rose slightly, trembling with a mix of disbelief and disgust. This isn't even about literature anymore. You're writing about rape and mutilation, about transformation through violence. This is not appropriate for school." Danny didn't flinch. His face remained impassive, as if he'd heard this before, as if this was just another routine part of the day. His voice was cold, distant. "I couldn't read Call of the Wild. It's just a stupid story about a dog. This is real." Mr. Jones sighed, his hand reaching up to stroke his thick mustache, his fingers trembling as he did so. He looked at Danny, his eyes softening for a moment, but the concern was palpable. "That's not the point, Danny. I'm worried about you. You're smart, Danny. You're a genius, but you have no discipline. You're obsessed with these dark, twisted things. Have you ever thought about your future? Have you even thought about college?" Danny's eyes flickered, his expression unreadable. He didn't respond immediately, as if the very thought of a future was something foreign, something out of reach. Mr. Jones leaned closer, his voice dropping lower, as if trying to reach into the depths of Danny's mind. "Where are you going to go to college, Danny? Who's going to take you if you keep this up? If you don't get your grades up, what happens then?" But Danny didn't answer. He only stared ahead, his mind elsewhere, lost in the fog of his own thoughts. The weight of Mr. Jones' words pressed down on him, but it didn't seem to matter. There was something in his eyes, something empty, something that had long since given up on hope. Danny shrugged again, the action slow and deliberate, as if his body was too tired to care anymore. His fingers absently toyed with the spaghetti stain on his shirt, the dried remnants of a meal long gone, now a permanent mark on his chest. He glanced at Mr. Jones, his eyes flat, void of any emotion. "I've got a family," he muttered under his breath, the words feeling hollow as they left his lips. Mr. Jones sighed, the sound heavy, as if he were carrying the weight of something much darker than just a troubled student. "Honestly, I don't know what I'm going to do with you, Danny, but I've already had a discussion with Principal Snyder. I've contacted your mother. We've set a date for next week." Danny's gaze never wavered. "Great," he said, his voice dripping with indifference. Mr. Jones, clearly frustrated, tried once more. "What do you have to say for yourself?" Danny's lips barely moved, the words a whisper, lost in the stillness of the classroom. "Nothing." The teacher's eyes narrowed, a flicker of something between concern and irritation crossing his face. "Look, Danny, I'm going to pretend I didn't hear that, but I expect a change in your attitude, understand?" Danny didn't respond, his face a mask of apathy. "Good," Mr. Jones muttered. "That's more like it. Now don't you want to get to class before the bell rings?" Danny didn't care about the bell. He didn't care about school. He didn't care about anything. He purposely missed the bus that afternoon, avoiding the suffocating, sterile confines of home and his mother's suffocating presence. Instead, he veered off, heading into the woods of Redwood Park, a place where the air was thick with the scent of decay and the whisper of forgotten things. The trees loomed over him like silent sentinels, their gnarled branches twisting into grotesque shapes. The forest floor was a carpet of dark earth, ferns, and patches of poison oak that seemed to bleed crimson under the fading light. The call of ravens echoed through the trees, their voices low and eerie, as if calling to something or someone lost in the shadows. Danny didn't flinch. He didn't care. He wandered deeper into the woods, his footsteps muffled by the thick underbrush, his mind elsewhere, lost in the disquiet of the forest. He followed the twisted paths, the dark trails winding through the towering redwoods, until he came to the base of Pickle Hill. The hill rose before him like a dark, menacing giant, its peak hidden in the mist. Without a second thought, Danny began his climb, pushing through the thicket of huckleberry vines that clawed at his legs. The air grew colder as he ascended, the trees growing denser, their branches weaving together like the fingers of some ancient, unseen hand. At the top, the world seemed to open up before him. The trees parted, revealing a clearing of vantage point where he could see the entire neighborhood below. The houses, clustered together like forgotten toys, seemed so small from here, so distant. The distant hum of life below felt alien to him, as though he were no longer part of it. He stood there for a long time, the chill of the wind biting at his skin, his eyes scanning the familiar yet foreign landscape. In the silence, it was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something, anything to happen. But Danny didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stared, lost in the dark, watching the world below him, as if waiting for it to come undone. Danny pulled himself over the ridge, his fingers scraping against the cold earth, his breath shallow and quick. As he crested the lip, his eyes caught something aglimmer, an almost ethereal gleam of amber autumn sunlight, reflecting off something pale and sickly in the distance. There, nestled at the edge of a small copse of trees, lay a body, a girl's body. She was perfect in her stillness, her creamy skin pale against the golden hues of the fading day. Her hair, blonde and shimmering, framed her face like a halo, untouched by the rot of time. At first glance, she seemed like a princess, caught in a dream, lying so perfectly still in the grass. But there was something wrong, something deeply wrong. Danny scrambled over the edge of the ridge, his heart pounding in his chest. His eyes widened as he drew closer, taking in the grisly sight before him. The girl was beautiful, her features still intact, but there was a sickness to her now. Her once rosy skin had turned a sickly blue, the color of death creeping up her limbs. Her cheeks, once flushed with life, were now sunken, drained of color. Her body was stiff, frozen in rigor mortis, but it wasn't the decaying stench he expected. No, she was fresh. A fresh kill. His gaze dropped to her neck, where the skin had been torn open, revealing the delicate, broken joints of her spine beneath the shredded muscle and tendons. But her face was untouched, immaculate, almost serene. He swallowed hard, his stomach churning as he took in the rest of her. Her right arm was missing, the stump raw and bloody, as if it had been severed with surgical precision. The wound was clean, too clean, a sharp, deliberate cut. The rest of her body was pristine, as if she had been carefully posed. At first he thought maybe animals had attacked her, but no. The way she lay, her body placed so deliberately, her arms folded neatly over her belly, her legs perfectly straight, told a different story. No animal had touched her. This wasn't the aftermath of a savage attack. This was something much worse. Danny glanced around, his heart racing. There were no signs of struggle, no blood stains, no traces of the girl's missing clothing. This wasn't the scene of the crime, it was the dumping ground. A place chosen with precision, where the body could be left to rot in peace, hidden away in the quiet of the woods. And then, the realization hit him like a cold slap. The killer would be back. You didn't bring a beautiful corpse like this to an isolated spot with such a perfect view, one that allowed you to see anyone coming pose it so meticulously, and not expect to return. No, the killer would come back. They always did. And Danny, he knew it. He could feel it in his bones. The game was just beginning. Danny was certain of one thing: the killer would be back. The thought clung to him like a shadow, gnawing at his insides, a dark obsession that grew with every passing moment. And Danny, more than anything, wanted to see it. He wanted to watch the killer return, to see what he would do to that beautiful, lifeless body. He wanted to be there when it happened, to witness the twisted ritual in its rawest form. The security store was the perfect place to prepare. As he entered, the dimly lit aisles filled with gleaming glass cases, each one showcasing tools of control and violence. Knives glinted under harsh fluorescent lights, bare mason tasers set like toys, and high-tech surveillance gear lined the shelves. The store was a shrine to paranoia, and Danny reveled in the possibilities it offered. He wandered up to the counter where a bored-looking salesman, no older than 20, sat flipping through a gaming magazine. His auburn hair was messy, and his freckles were scattered like a constellation across his face. He barely glanced up when Danny approached. "What do you want, kid?" The salesman muttered, barely acknowledging his presence. Danny leaned in, his voice low and steady. "I need a Raptor Wi-Fi network security system with a high-gain Yagi antenna and an Omni-masked antenna. But I was wondering, do I have to use the standard bullet camera, or can I substitute it with a piling covert Fuji KM f1 360 watt? The salesman blinked, clearly not expecting such a precise request. He stared at Danny blankly for a moment, before muttering, "Aren't you supposed to be in school or something?" Danny didn't flinch, he didn't care. He was skipping study hall, and he didn't have time for distractions. He wasn't here for small talk. His hands pressed firmly against the counter, his glasses pushed up his nose as he locked eyes with the salesman. "I'm asking if the Fuji KM F1 is compatible with the Raptor system or not," Danny repeated, his voice colder now, more insistent. The salesman, clearly annoyed, turned a page of his magazine, his eyes still not fully meeting Danny's. "What are you trying to do, capture Bigfoot or something?" Danny's eyes narrowed, his fingers curling into the counter as he leaned in closer. "Something like that. Now are they compatible or not?" The salesman sighed, clearly done with the conversation. "You got the money for this, kid?" Danny reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a thick wad of cash. Nearly $2,000, all of it saved up over the years. Every penny he'd ever earned or stolen, hoarded for this moment. The salesman's eyes flickered for a second. Then he stood up with a grunt. "All right, kid. Let's get you a system." Danny felt a thrill surge through him as he followed the salesman to the back of the store. The pieces were falling into place. Soon he would be ready. Soon he would be watching. Danny's heart raced as the clerk rang up his purchase, the total climbing higher than he had anticipated. The cashier's eyes flickered to the screen, and then to Danny. "Tax," he said flatly. "You're $6 short." Danny's pulse quickened, the thought of walking away empty-handed unbearable. "Come on," he pleaded, leaning over the counter, eyes wide with desperation. "Credit me $6. I swear I'll be back with it." The clerk didn't even look up from his magazine. "No can do, amigo." Danny's mind raced, searching for a solution. Then, his eyes landed on the watch, the one his father had given him. The only thing of value he had left, and the only thing he could offer. It wasn't worth much, but it meant everything to him. "How about this?" he said, his voice shaky but determined. "This watch. My dad gave it to me." The clerk raised an eyebrow, uninterested. "What? That piece of junk?" Danny's heart skipped. "It's got a calculator. It's worth more than $6 to you." The clerk took the watch, gave it a cursory glance, and then shrugged. "I'll tell you what. I need a calculator watch for programming. I'll take this and cover your $6, but you'll owe me 20 later." Danny's eyes lit up. "Deal." He handed over the watch, the last thing of his father's he had left, and in return, the clerk handed him the equipment he needed. With the antenna set up high in a Douglas fir tree on the edge of the clearing, Danny waited, his breath shallow with anticipation. The trees whispered around him, the wind carrying the scent of decay. His eyes never left the dead girl below, her body still and pale beneath the amber light of the autumn sun. Then, he heard it. The crunch of footsteps on dry leaves, slow and deliberate. His heart pounded in his chest. Was it the killer? Or had someone else stumbled upon the scene? His body tensed, frozen in place, straddling the tree, too terrified to move, too scared to even look down. The footsteps grew closer, closer, until they were right beneath him. Danny held his breath, praying for them to move on. But the silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Time seemed to stop. Then, a rustling, the sound of something sniffing the air. Danny's stomach lurched. He dared not look. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. The footsteps were still there, still right below him. And then, with a quiet snort, the creature moved forward. A deer. It stepped into the clearing, its hooves crunching the leaves beneath it, its dark eyes scanning the lifeless body. The deer sniffed at the corpse. its muzzle brushing the girl's pale skin, as if it were just another part of the forest. Danny exhaled in relief, his heart still racing, but the dread lingered. He was still waiting, watching, waiting for the killer to return. As Danny scrambled down the tree, his heart still pounding in his chest, he cast a fleeting glance at the deer. Its black eyes glinted in the fading light before it darted off into the brush, vanishing into the shadows. Danny stood there, breathless, as the forest seemed to close in around him. The trail back home felt longer, darker. The towering trees loomed like silent sentinels, their shadows stretching, swallowing the path ahead. The weight of what he had done finally settled in, a cold, creeping realization. What the hell am I doing here? The thought echoed in his mind, but it was followed by another. You should call the cops. You could be a hero. You could do the right thing. But then another part of him, darker, more insidious, whispered back. The part of him that had been ignited by the sight of that lifeless body. The part of him that felt the blood pulse through his veins, the sick thrill of it all. No, this is good. This is what you deserve. This is where you belong. And so he did nothing. It was too late. The deed had been done, and there was no going back. What was it Lady Macbeth had said? What's done cannot be undone. The days that followed blurred together in a fevered haze, a maddening rush of obsession. Danny could barely think of anything else. The corpse, her pale, bloated form haunted him. Every time he closed his eyes, her image was there, twisted and distorted in his mind. He couldn't escape it. He'd sit at his computer, the glow of the screen illuminating his face as he studied the footage from his makeshift security cameras. He watched her over and over, like a man possessed. The slow decay of her body fascinated him. The gas bloating her stomach, her skin darkening and wrinkling. The left eye shriveled, the edges of her skull beginning to peek through the thinning flesh. It was like watching art being created, or perhaps destroyed. And Danny was high on something far more potent than any drug. The endorphins exploded in his brain like fireworks, a rush of euphoria that made his skin tingle, his mouth dry, his body sensitive to every touch. He felt jittery, his eyes unable to focus, pupils dilated as though he were coming down from some fevered high. He couldn't stop. His face twisted with a nervous tic, his right side contorting in spasms. His thoughts were scattered, images of death and decay flooding his mind, playing on a loop. He read books, pages filled with descriptions of necrophilia, death, and the macabre. It consumed him. Waking, sleeping, eating, it didn't matter. He couldn't escape the images. He didn't want to. It was as if something inside him had cracked open, and he was drowning in the madness of it all. Danny had long stopped paying attention to the words, the phrases that spilled from the pages, fantasies of dismemberment. Grotesque carnage, each sentence more twisted than the last. He didn't care. He found himself laughing at the most inappropriate moments, a dark, unsettling giggle that bubbled up from deep inside him. His movements were stiff, unnatural, like something was wrong with his spine, his gait shuffling as if he were half-formed, caught between life and something far worse. His little sister noticed first. "You look different," she said, her voice tinged with something close to fear. Danny didn't care. The old surly him would have lashed out, but now he just grinned wickedly, nodding as if to confirm it. He was different. There was no denying it. But then, doubt crept in. Days passed, and the killer hadn't returned. Had he been wrong? Had he miscalculated? It was only a matter of time before someone found her some hiker, a group of Boy Scouts. It had happened before, in Eureka, at a drainage ditch. The body had been discovered. But then one day, it came to him like a revelation. As he stared at the live feed, something caught his eye, a flicker at the edge of the frame, his shadow. It moved, darting like a specter. Danny squinted, pushing his glasses up his nose, trying to make sense of it. Was it just the wind? The branches swaying in the breeze? No, this was something else. Something real. A figure stepped into the frame. Danny's breath hitched in his throat. It was Mr. Kirby, the gym teacher. The man he had never suspected. Danny's eyes widened, his mouth falling open in disbelief. No way in hell. It was him. Mr. Kirby was the killer. A laugh bubbled up from deep within Danny. First a soft chuckle, then an uncontrollable cackle, filling the room with its sickening sound. Holy shit! His pulse quickened, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it. This was what he had been waiting for. All the money, the risk, the planning, it had all led to this moment. He leaned forward, eyes glued to the screen, watching as Mr. Kirby surveyed the area, his gargantuan head swiveling nervously from side to side. The gym teacher crouched beside the body, his movements slow, deliberate. Danny could feel his skin prickle, the thrill of it coursing through him like an electric current. He was watching something far beyond the ordinary now, something dark, something twisted. And he couldn't look away.